Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicki Wilkins, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, 2020 Election Countdown. This is presented by the School of Public Affairs in partnership with the Sine Institute for Policy and Politics. We had this panel together 1 year ago, just about 1 year ago, and knew early on in the summer that we wanted to bring them back together to share with you their expertise and analysis of the current election season. So I'm going to toss it over to Betsy Fisher Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute in the School of Public Affairs, who will be moderating our event today. Hey, Betsy.
Hi there, great to see everybody. Thanks so much for being here on this 4 weeks to go to Election Day. So we wanted to bring the band back together. We've got a terrific group of experts to share their insights and give us a little sense of where we are at this point in the campaign. I want to introduce each of them briefly and then we will dive right into it. I know we have a lot to get to and we really want to take your questions as well. So please feel free to jump in the box there and put your questions in. We'll save plenty of time for those as we go along. First, I want to introduce Michael Steele, who is the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. He served during the first 2 years of Obama's presidency from 2009 to 2011. Prior to his chairmanship, he was the lieutenant governor of Maryland for several years, and it was actually the first African-American elected statewide in Maryland. Of course, we regularly see him now on MSNBC, where he is a political analyst. We're delighted he could be back with us. Amy Dacey is the executive director of our Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. She has a long career in politics and campaigns, including serving as the CEO of the DNC and as the executive director of Emily's List. She is also an AU alum, having received her master's in political science here in the School of Public Affairs. So thanks for being with us, Amy. Robert Costa is the national political reporter for the Washington Post. He is also a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC, and just because he doesn't have enough to do, he is the moderator of Washington Week on PBS, where we love to see him every Friday on that. So thanks for being back with us, Robert. And last but not least, Chris Donovan is currently the executive editorial producer at ABC News, where he works closely with George Stephanopoulos on all of his really big interviews. Prior to ABC, I'm proud to say he was a colleague of mine in my previous career at Meet the Press at NBC. And he is also an AU alum from the School of Public Affairs. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for being back with us as well.
Thanks.
So Bob, let me start with you. Here we are, 4 weeks to go. Give us a sense of the state of the race at this point, how you see it.
Well, it's hard to gauge the race because almost hour by hour, there's news that breaks.
Right.
And you think just to recent weeks, you have Bob Woodward's book, Rage, and all of the headlines from that and the audio to the death, the unfortunate death of Justice Ginsburg, to the president's health, the New York Times tax story. It's a torrent of news every day, every hour. And what you're seeing from voters in most polls are entrenched views. Republicans are sticking with President Trump, Democrats are sticking with Vice President Biden, and that the amount of undecided voters seems to be pretty small. And there's not a lot of ideological debates that are unfolding at this late stage in the campaign. It's really about news-driven events, perhaps peeling off some voters here or there. And the pandemic overshadows everything. And when I think back to March and April, talking to the president's top political advisors, they said his real enemy, his real opponent in this presidential race was not Biden or the Democrats, it's the virus. And that was brought back to the fore in recent days as the president was hospitalized. And so we're looking at a map that's similar to 2016 in some respects, with the industrial Midwest being so central. But there are new battlegrounds in 2020 that I'm really fascinated by and I've been covering, such as the Deep South, a competitive Senate race in South Carolina and North Carolina, competitive Senate races in Georgia. Texas even is potentially a place where Democrats could make gains, maybe even win the state. I spoke with Senator Ted Cruz at length this morning, and he said Republicans should be worried. His quote,
Hmm.
And so we're looking at a map where everything seems to be in play. Biden, of course, well ahead in most polls. But polling, as we discussed a few years ago, can only take you so far in understanding a fractured electorate in a chaotic time.
So where do you see sort of Biden being able to kind of change the map, if you will, from 2016? I mean, is it going to be first in a state like Iowa in the Midwest that you mentioned, or is it going to be more in like a state like Georgia, which is changing, so demographically in the South?
Based on my reporting, I think it's actually going to be pretty difficult for Biden to win Georgia or to win some other place in the South like Texas. He may do better than Secretary Clinton did. What really matters for Biden is activating Democratic voters in the suburbs and in the cities. And you look at a state like Wisconsin. I traveled there in 2016. Low enthusiasm for Secretary Clinton on the ground in the final week. I spent about 5 days in Milwaukee and its suburbs up around Wisconsin. The president in 2016 and again is likely to have strong support in exurbs in rural areas. His base will come out. But can Biden and Harris get the Democratic base and some more independent-minded voters to come out in better numbers in Milwaukee, in Columbus, Ohio, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania? And if the Biden coalition can more mirror what President Obama did in 2008 and 2012, it's very likely Vice President Biden could win the White House.
Interesting. So, Michael, let me ask you, first of all, I thought about this morning. It's been less than a week from the last presidential debate. That's how crazy and how many things have happened just in less than 1 week. But I wanted to ask you, Michael, what is the path as you see it for President Trump being reelected? Just putting on your RNC hat.
Sure.
As you look at the map, what is his best path?
Well, look, he's got some good options in front of him. I think setting aside all of the news that Robert alluded to, just looking at the core realities on the ground with respect to where the base is and those center-right independent voters out there. The president has got a lot more runway than I think people want to give him credit for. It does boil down to turnout. And the one thing Republicans have been very efficient with and very good at is turning out their base. They know where their voters are. They are in those exurbs. They are in those suburban communities, but they're also in some urban communities as well. And so, the president's appeal to Black men, for example, that's a direct shot into urban centers like Philadelphia and Detroit. Just peel off a small percentage of those votes. I don't need to capture it all. I just need a piece. And so that's the thinking that Trump has in front of him. So when he's looking at states like Arizona and Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, certainly those that were in the mix in 2016, that formula has not changed that much for him. What the goal is now is to hold the numbers you had and to tweak around the edges with some of these outlier votes like the African-American male vote, Hispanic men, where he's doing very well just generally with the Hispanic community. So I think the president's runway back to the White House is there. Now the question is, does the plane avoid the potholes that are being put on the runway as he's looking to lift off to re-election?
What are those kind of messages or strategy? You mentioned, outreach to Black men, Hispanics. What is resonating with those demographics that would be able to peel off some of those votes?
Well, they love the strongman appeal. They love the idea that he's a fighter.
Right.
They love the idea that he's pushing back against the system. He's raging against the noise, if you will. They love, even though they did not necessarily themselves benefit from the tax cuts, they like the idea of the tax cuts. There's not so much an appeal to Supreme Court justices and things like that for those particular constituencies. They have other interests, certainly around the economic piece, which is why the president keeps reminding African Americans, your unemployment is the lowest it's ever been.
Right.
And why he makes the appeal to suburban white women that he has, for example. talking about the sanctity and the safety of suburban America. Now, you may or may not agree with that messaging,
Right.
but as a political person, I have to understand and appreciate that it does work. It still has a higher level of appeal than one may want to appreciate or accept. And that's his secret weapon, if you will, that he knows that, you line up 10 voters, he can reach at least 7 of them with some measure of the appeals that he makes. And that's all he's looking for.
So as some of us are watching just in the last, 48 hours, some of the behavior that he's exhibited, him coming back to the White House, undermining COVID, saying don't let it dominate your life. All of that, is that an appeal to that same group that you're talking about, sort of the, like, I can beat this Superman approach, don't let this little virus get in the way of things?
It does, but here's the problem with COVID. Unlike those other subjects, COVID and racial issues tend to flip the script. Why? Because they're much more personal.
Mm-hmm.
People know people who've died from COVID, who may be suffering from COVID themselves, or a family member. People know, folks who've marched in support of Black Lives Matter. So that personalization breaks down this sort of strongman narrative. And all of a sudden people sort of step back and they go, yeah, but. And that's the problem. That's something that's different for Trump in 2020 than he saw in 2016. In 2016, when you asked voters about Hillary and Trump, for Hillary, it was like, well, I don't like her, period.
Right.
With Trump, it was, I'm not crazy about him, but.
Right.
So in this election, you have, I like what he's done with the economy, and I like where, how he's, showing strength, but. And that but is, in politics, not a good thing. When a voter has a hesitation about a candidate or a position that they've taken, that's an opening for them to move. And that's what you're seeing in the polling over the last few weeks, a few months actually, which has been consistent across the board for Joe Biden.
So Amy, let me ask you on the flip of that question, what do you see as Biden's best path to 270?
Well, I think one of the big differences that we haven't talked about yet from 2016 is now Trump is an incumbent, right? It's not a do as I say, not as I do. Like, he has a record now. And I think that that's a very different piece of it. And I think the Biden campaign has to have him own that record and talk about the decisions that he's made as an administration, the mistakes that have happened, the lack of leadership on some of these key issues, in some of these areas. And not unlike what Michael said, he's been very good about turning out his base. Well, he actually turns out the Democrats' base pretty well too, in some of the divisive, visceral kind of things that he's putting out there. I do think that when you think about those potholes, Michael, some of them have been self-imposed. At this moment, he contracted COVID. He could have shown some empathetic, I understand now what this is about. I think his advisors would have preferred that than some of this bravado coming out of this, because this is something that is affecting more and more people. And so I think, with Biden, it's kind of got to be that message of, who do you actually want to lead us through these problems? There's not a moment now that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. There is a financial, crisis, and a lot of people who might have liked that kind of messaging from him are losing their jobs. They're losing their health care, and they see kind of, his messaging and his access to all this, opportunities as he got sick that they don't have. And then I do think this social unrest as well, that combination, and the fact that he's an incumbent and should be taking care of these problems. I think the Biden campaign has to show the difference in leadership styles, the ability to consensus build and bring people together to solve issues. And I think they're also doing a good job talking about how, Vice President Biden will seek the expertise of experts in decision-making and, make sure that he's making decisions with the information that he needs and with the team that he needs. And I do think that some of that will resonate.
Interesting. Chris, you're going to be sort of on the front lines election night and in the ABC News headquarters there as returns are coming in, and we're looking at different states and, a lot of absentee ballots now getting counted. I think election night is going to look very different. I'm not sure we're going to be able to know a lot of what we need to know sooner rather than later. But what are you going to be looking for sort of early in the night on election night, as some of the early states poll closing times? Are there particular areas that you're going to be focusing on that will give us a sense of what's to come?
I think what's interesting is I think the country's having a conversation about how election night's going to be different this
Right.
year than it has been in previous years. And internally, every news organization, I think, is part of that is not continuously repeating 28 days till election day, because part of that is, I just looked this morning, more than 4 million people have already voted.
Right.
And that's just going to keep increasing in large numbers as we get closer to election day. And to your point about, I'm not an expert at what districts, what states are the best to look at. I look at reporting from people like Bob and people at ABC and people that, focus exactly on this. So one of the jobs I had when I first got out of college was at the Almanac of American Politics. Michael Barone wrote an encyclopedia of every congressional district, and you could talk to him and you could say, Texas 3rd District, and he could tell you the history of it, the demographics of it and stuff. I never was like that. I'll go look it up and read 2 hours about that and stuff. But the people I trust, the people we've been talking about, have, one of the things I'm most interested in is a lot of the states, you've seen a lot of conversation that a lot of the states can't start counting their votes until election day by law. And we're going to fall into, everyone's focused on Pennsylvania type states and stuff, Pennsylvania, Michigan and stuff. There are some states that do count early, Florida, North Carolina, stuff like that. And the people I trust talking to, say that we should kind of look at things like, North Carolina, I think the polls close at 7:30 on election night.
Yeah.
I think Florida is 8 o'clock. But like North Carolina is a good kind of indication if Biden's winning by a lot, that could kind of be indicative, because a lot of the key, those 3 states that we've been talking about that President Trump won, that most people didn't expect him to win, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that's going to be slow going on the counting of the votes. But if you look at places like North Carolina that could push over, Bob, I saw you were interviewing. I didn't get to watch Ted Cruz this morning. John Cornyn, I don't know if this came up with him and stuff, but John Cornyn, who's the other senator from Texas, was running has his own Senate race, which I think there's debate how close that is or not. But he did an interview with the Houston Chronicle yesterday where he kind of unloaded on President Trump, which is unusual for many Republicans, but especially John Cornyn. And he talked about how, he let his guard down about coronavirus, that he was too positive. He should learn from this. And also, I don't get along with him on a lot of issues and stuff. Some of that's personal to the Senate race, that to him and his future, I think, of what he's thinking about. But it really caught my eye as something that there's always talk if Democrats are going to win Texas or not. I'm not good at guessing those kind of things, but it definitely was a noted thing that this Republican in Texas, in a either fairly close race or not, is already kind of distancing himself from the president, and it was something that I took note of.
That's interesting, Chris. Yeah, because Robert, your piece today sort of gave us that framing of sort of the Republican Party and some members, kind of going right along with Trump, and others like Cornyn, not singing from the same sheet especially as it revolves around COVID, right?
To build on Chris's point, there are some really interesting aspects of my reporting now in terms of the GOP, because so many of my sources, especially elected officials, feel like they're in the middle of a political hurricane. And Senator Cornyn is trying to navigate a state that's traditionally red. He's in a tough reelection race. He's expected to win, but it's closer than he'd like it to be. So he goes to the Houston Chronicle editorial board, as Chris mentioned, and starts talking about the president's mistakes on the response to the pandemic. And so that's one way of navigating the storm. And then yesterday we saw Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, like Cornyn, an ally of President Trump. He gave an interview to a conservative talk radio show host where he called the response to the pandemic unjustifiable hysteria and said the shutdown should never have happened. It's time for people to go back to work. And Senator Johnson, to be sure, is not only an ally of President Trump, he's someone who has contracted the coronavirus. And so all of these senators are picking different strategies in the closing weeks of this campaign. But most of them feel the same way when you talk to them privately or their strategists. They feel like they're in a corner. There's only so much they can say against President Trump. They need to have his voters on their side, but they don't want to get too far. They don't want to get too close to him either, because if you start to embrace President Trump and you're running for re-election, you could be in a situation like Senator Graham, where he's going on television almost every night, talking to conservative voters and viewers and saying, I need you to donate. I'm losing to Jamie Harrison in the fundraising race. So there's a hint of desperation. Sometimes the hint's bigger than others across the political map for the GOP.
Michael, what do you think of that? How members in the party are trying to navigate, especially as it relates to COVID?
Oh, they've been navigating for a while. Oh yeah, they've got so many North Stars. They're all over the place, and it's understandable because basically Trump has put them in this position on a variety of issues in any number of ways, where to Robert's point, they've had to not only look ahead to see where things were going, but then look to their right and their left and behind them to see who's with them. Because they need that base to stay with them along the way. They can't afford to have that base, and I put base in quotation marks, peel off, because you're really only talking a fraction of the total number of Republican voters out there. You're basically talking that base is that primary Republican voter, who is the hardcore, just like on the left, you have, the hard driving voters in primaries who tend to stick with candidates or move off of candidates that change the dynamics. Here, Trump has been able to navigate those voters into his orbit and keep them there. And as long as they've been held there, you have the kind of back and forth, sometimes mealy-mouthed explanations for Trump's behavior, because they don't want to get on the wrong side of a tweet, which then sets off that base against them. And now not only are they having to, in places like Texas, hold on to that number, but then also try to, pull the number of center-right voters, independents, and general election Republicans that will help them get reelected. So Robert's got it exactly right in that regard, and it has been the problem for a lot of Republicans across the country, which speaks to what happens on the other side of all of this. Where do they go if there's no Trump there,
right,
in the White House? And if there is, how do they then reset the table for 2024 when they're all of a sudden now Trump is not going to be the main player, that someone else will emerge? And will they emerge in the image of Trump, or will they emerge in the image of the traditional GOP? And a lot of these folks like Johnson and others are going to be straddling that space going forward.
How does the party, what does the party look like in a post-Trump era?
Hell if I know. It's going to be a hot mess is what it's going to be, because keep in mind, there is no post-Trump era. As long as Donald Trump has his finger on a tweet button, he's going to be in the game.
Yeah.
So whether he is former President Trump or President Trump between now and 2024, it doesn't matter. That he's still going to be a player in the mix. The question becomes more of what is the degree of his influence if he's not in the White House.
Can I just jump in real quick with Michael?
Sure.
Michael, don't you think a lot of it's going to depend, to that question, about the scope of victory?
Right.
If Vice President Biden has a LBJ 64 style landslide, that put the conservative movement back in the GOP in a big way. They came roaring back in 76 and 80 with Reagan, but it took some time to recover. If it's a close election, you can see Trumpism lingering immediately in the GOP and being kind of the beating heart of the GOP. But if Biden wins 40 states, it's hard to see how Republicans suddenly say Trumpism is the future.
Well, I see your point, but I slightly disagree with it. I don't think people appreciate just how deep into the sinews of the GOP Trumpism has flowed. The question then becomes, where does that Trump voter, that 40% that's been with him come hell or high water, ride or die, they don't go back to traditional Republicanism. They just don't. They won't. And so the question becomes, do you then work with what you have left, and where does that piece go? You've got currently elected officials, the Ron Johnsons, and the House membership, the Freedom Caucus types. Where do they go? You think they just go back and recess into the crevices and let the next iteration of Paul Ryan or John Boehner take control? I don't see that happening. And what I understand and how I'm talking and hearing from people is that there's a battle royale to come, which actually should have occurred 30 years ago, because the fight after Reagan got stilted and got stunted to a large degree. And the fight over who would be the next Reagan never completed itself. And so now you're going to have this fight, I think, over whether or not Trumpism is a legitimate thing. And you're going to have people, Jim Jordan and others, who are going to be articulating that, because they can't go back to the country and go, psych, we were just kidding. The kids in cages, oh no, we were quiet on that for a reason. And we didn't think it was real. People aren't going to buy it. So where do they go? They either have to go down with that, or they have to walk away from it. And so I think they're going to stick with Trump, and that puts a real battle in front of the party.
So Amy, I'm sure this is great for you listening to the divisions within the Republican Party, but I want to ask you about on the other hand too, divisions within the Democratic Party that we've seen certainly, on full display in the primaries. We have seen some of the more progressive wing of Democratic Party sort of come home for Biden, but in a potential Biden presidency, how vocal will that more progressive end of the party be in terms of their agenda?
Listen, I think a lot of this will be about expectations. If the Democrats win the presidency, suddenly it's the Senate and the House, like there's going to be an expectation to try and put forth more, progressive liberal ideas to try and pass it, through and move things forward. I do think that, the interesting part is primaries are about contrast. There has to be some kind of, way for the candidates to kind of make their way through. And Vice President Biden, certainly was trying to be inclusive as, each candidate was dropping out and bring them back in. But also you heard him in some mention in the debate, he is the Democratic Party. This is the way he feels about some of the ideals. I think in an interesting way in this election, campaign's been able to make it a lot more about the values of each party and the values of the, of empathy and of like looking out for you and of like trying to make sure everybody has an opportunity, and that in this time of crisis, who's listening kind of thing. But then when you get down to the governing is always different than the campaigning. And when we get to governing, are those different ideas going to be able to come together and find some kind of consensus middle ground? I do think you're better off if people are open and willing to have those conversations. I think through the primary process on the Democratic side, you saw that with the platform process, with moving through the convention. Governing is always a little bit, more challenging. But if you have a Speaker Pelosi, if you have a leader in the Senate with, Chuck Schumer, if you have a Vice President Biden, how that comes together on some of these issues will be important. But it will be the expectations of a lot of those individuals that have a part of that process.
So I want to, there's a lot of questions in the question queue about the debates. So I want to get to that before we take some other questions.
I would have loved to watch the debate with you, Michael.
I know. Maybe we should have like a show of just like reactions during the actual debate.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Yeah.
But Trump is insisting, right, that I think he tweeted today, looking forward to the debate next week, right? Which is next Thursday. Of the next week in Miami. Charles is asking a question. Charles is actually one of my students, so I'm going to read his question. If the debates are to proceed as scheduled, is it possible for either candidate to make up significant ground and change the nature of the race as it stands today? So let me shoot that to Chris first, because Chris, you and I both worked on countless debates over the years. Just as you see it, how much weight is put into those debates? Can that change this late in the game? Considering what you said at the beginning in terms of so many people already having voted, can the next debate be any sort of a game changer?
Yeah, I think Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, I think what's interesting is a couple things. One is, you know, a lot of the recent polling also showed that people have made up their minds, that the number of people who are still could be persuaded to change their mind is very small. And especially when it comes to, you know, I've been obsessed with the list that Bob talked about kind of in September. You know, everything from the Atlantic story reporting about the president's comments about the military to then Bob in the Washington Post reporting on Bob Woodward's interviews with the president about playing down the virus, to the president at the podium refusing to commit that he'd have a peaceful transfer of power before kind of backing that after a couple of days. And then the New York Times story about the tax cuts, all of those things that, you know, we've seen recent polling in the last couple of days that showed Biden seemed to be, you know, ahead even more. But a lot of this is still, you know, where it was before all of this. People, a lot, you know, even though those stories were big, almost all those stories, the New York Times and taxes have been an issue for 5 years with President Trump. You know, the military comments were July of 2015 when he made comments about McCain. So a lot of all that is kind of packed in what people have already thought. Debates themselves, you know, I'm fascinated by the one, Betsy, you and I got to work on was the town hall one. You know, that is a, you know, fairly recent phenomenon starting in '92 with Bill Clinton. He insisted he really wanted that town hall debate because he had done all these town halls and he thought he did really well connecting with people. And it was that first town hall that they did where everyone remembers that George Bush looking at his watch a couple times and Bill Clinton walking up to that voter and having that human interaction with them.
Which all seems very quaint by today's standards, though, too, right?
Exactly. And I think those are always seen as outsized moments, right? Like there was the town hall debate where Al Gore walked up to George Bush and seemed to kind of invade his personal space, and President Bush like nodded at him and people laughed and stuff. There was all these outside attention to very specific moments.
Or Gore sighing, remember that one too?
Yes, exactly. So I think the you know, the context of we have these moments all the time now, and everything everyone is seeing when the president speaks through a tweet, 85 million, I'm not sure what's up to now, million people immediately see what he's saying, immediately see videos. If Vice President Biden says something where he's had gaps or mistakes or things that people said were untruths earlier, you would see those immediately as well. It's fascinating because you know, the town hall that's supposed to happen now. George did a town hall with the president last month, and Vice President Biden's done 2 now with the networks. He did one with CNN that same week and one with NBC last night.
Right.
And both of them act not completely different, but they act different in the setting where they know not only are they trying to gain the vote of the individual person that's asking the question, but they know how everything's being perceived. Are they being, you know, everything's based on that Bill Clinton aspect of '92. Are they engaging with the person? Are they being personal with them? Are they answering their question and stuff? So, you know, if anyone that didn't see President Trump with George and with voters, it's interesting to watch because it was much different than the back and forth with Vice President Biden at the debate last week. He was very well aware that he was trying to engage and be empathetic with people and stuff. So if this does happen next week, I think it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. Do they engage each other like they did in the last debate, or is it purely on the people? And then you know, everyone being careful analysis wise, you know, which I don't do, but it will be interesting to see after if there is this, oh, look, they're completely different, or, you know, like they're both very well aware of what that situation is. And I don't know how much either one of them can convince people. Part of President Trump's, just by the polling, part of President Trump's problem I think, in why he might be losing, if the polling says is right, is that it's been really hard. This election is a referendum on the president, like every re-election campaign. And people's views of the president are kind of there, right? He's been on the world, in the country for 30 years, but in the politics for 5 years. But they also have established views of Vice President Biden, right? And good and bad. And that hasn't changed much through this whole thing either. So one moment in a debate now, if we got together 2 weeks from now, there could have been a moment that changed everything. You never know. But I think things are baked in to how people feel about how they interact with people and how empathetic they are, or how they behave in certain environment.
So Bob, let me ask you, do you think sort of having that town hall debate that Chris alluded to is a better format for Trump? Could he come out as being more empathetic to people and less contentious like the last debate?
Well, everything here is the context, because you look at recent debates amid the pandemic, such as the Harris and Graham one in South Carolina, and even the upcoming vice presidential debate this week. Plexiglass will now be used to protect from the coronavirus. President Trump has been infected with the coronavirus. Are they actually going to have the president standing there without plexiglass, engaging with voters, someone who's recently been hospitalized? It's almost impossible to imagine the kind of Bill Clinton 1992 moment that Chris detailed. And what I'm hearing is that the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is nonpartisan and organizes these gatherings, is in touch with Steve Scully from C-SPAN, the moderator for the town hall down in Miami, in touch with both campaigns. But a lot of these discussions are fluid, and how this looks, whether the voters are perhaps beamed in virtually versus being there in Florida to protect against exposure to the virus, all of these things are being discussed.
Can I just add to that for a minute, Betsy? Because I think the interesting thing for me about the debates is kind of what Chris pointed to, like, who are they really for anymore?
Right.
Because who's made up their minds and who hasn't? Are they more of a GOTV rally platform to try and, energize the base rather than try to get to these undecided voters? I think the other big thing that, I was struck with was the coverage the next day was more about what people wouldn't say or wouldn't, rather than what they would say about the policy agreements that they had. The news really was dominated the next day about why, President Trump wouldn't denounce white supremacy. Why wouldn't he, just, come out and say that? And I think it was a lot of that. A lot of it was like, what was Biden really saying about the Green New Deal or not? Where traditionally these debates were supposed to be about, like, where do you stand on this issue? Where do you stand on that issue? And I don't think that you saw that much of it. And then the other question is, what have they become as far as who's in charge of fact checking during the whole debate? Is it the opponent's, responsibility? Is it the moderators? Is it outside forces trying to delve through and look at the content as it goes? So it'll be really interesting. People are voting. We, as Chris mentioned, over 4 million people have already voted. You've got less than 5% that are undecided. So who are they for? The timing, I think, is interesting. The format and how this happens. They talk about changing the debate rules. I don't think there was a problem with the debate rules. It's about, like, how are people actually behaving during the debate, and are they talking about what they stand for and what issues they care about, and what their leadership will be different. And I think that's why I'm very interested to see the vice presidential debate, because it'll be interesting to see the contrast there from what we saw from the first one as well.
For sure. Mike, let me get your thoughts on the debates, but then I also want to send a question from Kenneth to you. He is asking about if you could evaluate the possibility of serious disruption from a contested outcome and what might happen there.
Sure. All right. So on the debates, I have a slightly different view on debates from my colleagues and friends here. I don't think there should be any more presidential debates at this point. I think the president, 74-year-old with some real health issues, suffering from COVID-19. If I'm his staff, the image of him, knowing what we do know about his health right now, with plexiglass around him, reinforces a negative message on COVID-19 that doesn't help them at all. They don't want to talk about COVID-19 before. They thought they had found the perfect off-ramp with the nomination of Coney Barrett. And now they are up to their eyeballs in COVID-19. The imagery is not there. The idea now that you're going to possibly have a debate where there won't even be real people there because of his health situation, and the concern for others in that space. I just think the narrative is too much. I watched the president last night try to put on this brave strongman act. The man is sick. He was breathing heavily. You could see he was in some pain at certain points standing there on that balcony. I don't know what the hell they're doing at the White House with this man at this point. Someone needs to take control and in charge of the president's health, period. So debates, if I got the call, would be, okay, we've done the one, we're good. Certainly to the point of who you left to talk to at this point. There's no real upside for it. So that's that. The vice presidential debate, I think, is going to be very interesting. And that, I think, should set the final period, if you will, for this part of the campaign, because the next 4 weeks is a whole different animal. Those of us who've done these campaigns know it's a very different kind of race starting Thursday. So on the question of, what happens on the other side of this, how you evaluate what we're stepping into, there are a lot more unknowns and in this uncharted territory. We've got 4 million people who've already voted. Voting is still going on. Some states are starting to will count their votes real time. Other states won't count till November 3rd. So what that means for the night of November 3rd is question mark. And unless, as was noted, I think by Chris earlier, that you look at a state like North Carolina, you look at some of the tells that are out there to see how a Joe Biden or Donald Trump is doing, will give you a sense of whether or not this is going to be a long haul, or we're going to just have a short run where, you'll get the final sense of where the election is by Thursday or Friday. But in the meantime, the real concern is how the president responds. If the president, looking at a map, same day map, election day map that shows a lot more red than blue, decides to go out and announce and declare that he's the winner, and that anything to the contrary is rigged, that could set off an enormous amount of alarm bells across the country and secretaries of state's offices, not to mention what that will mean for any judicial and legislative actions in the states as well. So my prescription is just stay calm. Just, vote early, don't vote often. Okay. Despite what the president says, you can't vote more than once, people. All right. Just stay calm, trust the system to do what it needs to do. Because at a certain point, this is out of the hands of the voters. It is out of the hands of the politicians in the campaigns, and it is in the hands of election operations. The men and women who are going to be counting those ballots, logging those ballots. And here's one last point, key thing to note, that when you get your ballot, I just got mine over the weekend, mailed it back into the state of Maryland. When they send it out to you, that's logged. When it comes back in, it's logged. When it is open, it's logged. When it is counted, it's logged. So there is a tracking system all along the way with your ballot. And that's why we don't have this escalation in fraud that some are projecting out there. All right, so let's just be honest about what is and what isn't happening. Our electoral system is one of the strongest in the world. Why? Because it's not federalized, it is state-based. And every state has put in place with greater or lesser degrees of security and success, a system that works. So I think we need to start trusting that system again, despite the crazy noise about mail-in ballots and rig this and rig that. It is not rigged, folks. It just isn't. as someone who's been in this system for 40 years, I know when it goes bad. We had a bad case here in Maryland back in 1994. We rooted it out. We know what the problem was. We fixed it. That's how the system works.
Amy, let me get your thoughts on that. And then also there's a question from Daniel about voter suppression and what role that could play in the outcome of the election this year.
Well, I always love an opportunity where I can say I agree with Michael Steele. And you know, I mean, this is literally, you know, what he said is absolutely true. There is no cases of fraud. People should feel confident. If there's ever an issue, sometimes it's voter error. So
Yeah.
I always say, and we've got information for students that are on this call to help them with the process, you don't need to just say you're going to vote or pledge to vote. You need a plan to vote, because in every state that you're in, there's different nuances about some of the rules. You need a plan to vote. And so obviously we want as many, you know, people, eligible voters, voting as possible. And I do think we've seen some indications, especially early on, that 61% already have, you know, early voted compared to in 2016, 41%. So it's encouraging to see people taking this seriously and having a plan to vote to go in and do that. And I think that I was on a, you know, stopped by and visited a phone bank that was happening in Wisconsin this weekend. A lot more of the conversations weren't about those persuasion calls. They were about helping people to understand voting and making sure they had a plan to vote. So I think that's really, you know, important as we kind of move from that. That being said, there's also been misinformation out there, you know, sending supporters to the poll to monitor and track. There are systems in place, as Michael said, to watch these systems to make sure they're accurate with the people that are hired to do this, with, you know, poll watchers and whatnot. I think that there's always that worriedness about, you know, getting misinformation, saying, you know, stay in line, vote, all of these things that we've seen, you know, cycle after cycle. I think there's been some misinformation put out by the president and others about, you know, the system, and that, you know, it's wrought with fraud, but it's not. And I do agree that as long as you have a plan to vote, there's resources out there, vote.org, others that are nonpartisan that are there to help you do that. And then we just encourage people to go to those resources.
Great. Bob, let me ask you any thoughts on the election issue, and then I also wanted to just get your thoughts on sort of some of those down ballot races. We have a couple of questions about races to watch. I know Michael mentioned a couple of them, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, et cetera. But what are you looking at sort of down ballot as well?
I want to come back to something that Amy mentioned,
Sure.
which is the Democratic Party, because we talk so much about the GOP, as we should. It is the raging story of our time, the evolution of the GOP into the party of Donald Trump. At the same time, the political debate and even acrimony inside of the Democratic Party is an intriguing and fascinating story.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of frustration right now among my sources in Senator Sanders' world about how Vice President Biden said at the last debate, "I beat the socialist," and they interpreted that as somewhat of a dismissive remark, that he's not going to take them seriously.
Party.
Right, exactly right, Betsy. He said, "I am the Democratic Party," and had an echo to them of almost President Trump. I alone can do this, in the sense that Biden is defining the party through him, this moderate Democrat, a hawk, at least in terms of how he voted on Iraq, which he later regretted. But you're seeing Bernie Sanders and others on the left united behind Biden, and Sanders has shrugged off kind of the Biden remarks as politics as usual, because they have this shared common foe in President Trump.
Right.
But if Biden wins January 2021, February 2021, you're going to have Senator Sanders in the Senate, a possible Democratic Senate majority. You'll have a House Democratic majority, possibly, that continues with Representative Ocasio-Cortez and maybe a new crowd of liberals who are insurgents running down ballot this year. So the Democratic Party could suddenly become a bigger story, especially if they see Biden as a president who, at 78 years old, may not be trying to mount an ideological project, maybe more of a transition president if he's elected. And that leaves a lot of room for debate and fights over the future.
I think he actually mentioned
a fight that they'd rather have, though. So I do think that, you know, winning this election is probably the goal right in front of them. And yes, there's going to be differing ideas. It will be interesting to see how it plays out if there's a victory for Democrats in the presidential race.
Can I just from my own experience to speak to that? Because one man's Tea Party is another man's progressive movement. All right. So I just need you to understand, and I've said this to Tom Perez and I've said it to Democrats, Jim Jordan and Ocasio-Cortez, two sides of the same coin inside the House in terms of what they want and what their agenda is. And you saw what they did to Speaker Boehner and Speaker Ryan. Speaker Pelosi and whoever comes after her, no different. So these ideological battles have serious fault lines. And the movement on the left is the same as it was and is on the right. Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party, two sides of the same coin. Where you see these energies right now within both parties is with the progressive left and the conservative right. And so those folks that occupy that center right, center left space have been sort of angling and trying to hold on. On the right, it's kind of done, right? And Trump came in and he was the avatar for that. Bernie Sanders is the avatar on the left. If you go back and look at 16, I can't tell you the number of Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump voters I ran into at the Democratic National Convention. Yeah. So there are a lot of warning signs out there, and these big ideological battles are important, but they need to be grounded in something. And that's going to be one of the initial tests, I think, of Joe Biden if he's president.
Chris, let me ask you a question from Raphael. He says, how is the news media and coverage of the race going to have an impact in the coming weeks? You're muted, Chris. There you
Yeah,
go.
I know. I'm still figuring it out. 7 months in. I honestly have no clue. I think that's part of the, I think a lot of it, to what I just said earlier, in people's views on the candidates is also about people's views on the media. It's something that our old boss, Tim Russert, used to talk about all the time, is everyone goes to their corner and watches what they want to hear, right. When it comes to opinion journalism, especially and stuff. So that is only increased. That's only gotten worse. The context for it's in the past month, in the last month, especially to Michael's point about how the last month of an election is also like a different world than everything else. Everything is scrutinized. Every word is scrutinized from the candidates, but also from the media. Any story they put up, any report about their candidate, if they don't like, they think there's a whataboutism, or that they're trying to do both sides, that's not fair. So I think the earlier thing I was talking about there's a lot of reflection, I think, everywhere about how to cover all of these things, right? Like how to cover the candidates, how much airtime to give them, the import on everything they say or what they say. I always go back to one of the main things I do for my job is I help prep for big interviews, debates, things like that. But on a daily basis, we have a sharing system at ABC with just distribution lists. And I'm constantly sending things to that of historic context, remember he or she used to say this, or they say this now and stuff. But I always share often when there's a breaking news event or when there's a big moment, questions, right? I'm trying to think of what questions we should be asking the candidates, the president at a different moment. And it always surprises me. It's still amazing how many things are happening so quickly that we don't even focus on so many of the issues that any other candidate, any other president, we'd be spending days with outrage from people and stuff. So in the limited time we have in this month, I think, we'll see if those two debates happen and the attention on those. But I think there's going to be a daily rehash of a lot of the same themes we have heard over and over again. And then, like I said, I keep going back to this, especially about election night. A lot of trends seem to be happening and people we just don't know until the votes are counted, until, you know, people constantly say, well, it doesn't matter that this person says this or this candidate says this. We won't know until the voters make that decision, right? And they decide this is what they care about.
Let me ask Robert, from just picking up on that, like from a practical standpoint, as Chris mentioned, there's just so much going on. It's nonstop. How do you, as someone in the media who's kind of setting the agenda, figuring out not only what you're going to report on for the Post, but then what you're going to have on the agenda on a Friday on Washington Week, how do you, just from a practical standpoint, go about kind of thinking of, you know, what's important to focus on? Is it just kind of the latest, the latest bit of news that's happened? How do you keep up with it all?
It's a great question. Every day as a reporter, you have to shed your assumptions, almost like you're taking off a coat, and not have your assumptions guide anything, because we live in a shattered time where the electorate is divided. The way politics and parties play out their different agendas and debates is unpredictable and rarely abides or follows historic norms. And so assumptions and sometimes even polls can be unhelpful or not helpful enough in understanding the news. So I also try to stay cool, because things can get so hot in this moment because of those divisions that you can't live on Twitter or live in your own world as a reporter. You have to really listen and not assume that voters are going to hear a story like the Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg story about President Trump's alleged comments about veterans, or read Bob Woodward's book and suddenly change their entire mind. Or even the handling of the pandemic will somehow be the end for President Trump, which many people predicted or assumed for months, yet the polling has remained relatively stable. And I spoke to former Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire, for example, the other day, where he told me that most Republican voters up in New Hampshire, and he's pretty social with them up there still, think of the pandemic as something that's like a natural disaster, and they're not going to blame President Trump for it. And you don't really hear that a lot in some of the coverage. And I just try to remember that how some critics of President Trump perceive things is not always how everyday voters perceive different issues. And so as long as you stay cool and you assume nothing, and you still are vigorous in your reporting and calling people to account, call a lie, investigate as much as possible. I've been part of this accountability series at the Washington Post to hold President Trump and his administration to account on how they've downplayed the virus repeatedly and mishandled the response. You could do that in a vigorous way, but also make sure that you're not starting to say what this all means, because it's not for us to decide as reporters, it's for voters to decide.
Right. Well, that's a perfect way to end, because, you know, as I alluded to in the question, there's so much to cover. We could probably stay here for like 4 hours talking about all of these things. I want to thank you guys for joining us. I want to let everyone know too that to please check our Women in Politics Institute website and register for an event that we are going to do in conjunction with the Sign Institute with Amy on Thursday night to talk about Wednesday's vice presidential debate with Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. We're going to have Candy Crowley, formerly with CNN, who was a debate moderator herself in 2012, Casey Hunt, who covers Capitol Hill for NBC News, and Karen Finney, a Democratic strategist. So we hope you all will join us for that. And I know the Sign Institute has a lot of other great programming coming up, so check out their website as well. And really, Michael and Robert and Amy and Chris, thanks for sharing your insights with us. Maybe we will try to reconvene in 2021 and decipher what exactly happened on November 3rd. And thanks everybody for joining us today, and take care and don't forget to vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.